All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 2 for MPA623A. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm sure more folks will come in along the way. So since it's 6 o'clock, we'll go ahead and get started and not waste your time tonight. For tonight, what we're going to talk about, as we said before, is we're going to talk about differences between public and private organizations. And what those differences then mean for the measurement and definition of organizational effectiveness. I did go through and review all the discussion board posts that were made that came in by this morning. They're all good. I have really no major feedback to give except for one little piece of feedback. On a few of them, I did notice that the authors used sources, but they didn't have the references at the bottom of the post. So just make sure that any resources that you are using in your essay, that you then go ahead and provide those APA references then at the bottom of your post. So just make sure to do that. Otherwise, everything was good. I think that they were insightful. I think they were thoughtful. They certainly addressed the prompt well, and I was very happy with them. So what you did for discussion board number 1, go ahead and keep the same standards in for discussion board number 2. I provided grades, and I also provided some feedback for everyone in that feedback box. Most of my feedback was just talking about different models of effectiveness that we are going to talk about in a couple of weeks. A lot of folks talked about a model of effectiveness that we will talk about in a couple of weeks without knowing right now what that model is. But if you did that, then I told you, well, this is an example of this model, and it's a model we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks down the road. So just some really brief, 1 and 2 paragraph feedback is what I gave for most of the posts. But so far, so good. Like I said, the same standards you apply to this first discussion board post, you'll want to apply then for the second discussion board post. And that second discussion board post is then due for next week. Again, your initial post by this Friday, and then your response to at least one classmate then due by Sunday. For that second Blackboard essay, Canvas essay, I guess it is, what you will be doing is you will be taking your organization, comparing it to a private sector organization, and highlighting a couple of the differences that distinguish your organization from a private sector organization. If you're working for a private sector organization, you'll just reverse that logic and compare it to a public organization. So 2 factors or characteristics that distinguish your organization from a private sector organization. And then what do those 2 differences mean for how your organization then measures effectiveness? So the same standards apply then for that Canvas essay number 2. Then in addition to doing Canvas number 2, then you also have your background paper that is due next Monday on February 7th by 11:59 p.m. on February 7th. We've talked about that background paper last week when we talked about the syllabus. So I think everyone has a good working knowledge of what you're doing for that background paper. But in essence, it's a very brief paper, 3 to 5 pages, where you are educating me about the problem or the issue that you are selecting to use for the paper assignments in this class. When you do that, 2 major things you're going to cover. Number 1, give you a description of the issue. Description of the issue is basically, what is it? Why is it important? Who's involved in it? Kind of those W questions that we always ask, the what, the why, the who. And then you'll also then go on in a second part of the paper and tell me about the background of the issue or problem, where it came from. Is it a new problem? And specifically, what types of attempts the organization has made in the past to try and address that problem or that issue. So again, 3 to 5 pages, very brief background paper, then due on February 7th. William, go ahead.
Yeah, could the issue be a little bit like a combination of 2 issues? Let's say if we're looking at staffing, we can look at how hard it is to get some certain staff, but also retaining staff. Could that be kind of combined a little bit, because it's kind of like similar, but it's technically 2 issues?
Absolutely, yeah. I think because it does kind of form together and merge together into one big issue in terms of staffing. So yeah, that you can certainly talk about those 2 aspects of staffing problems. Okay, good. Any other questions about the background paper? Okay, as always, if anything occurs to you between now and February 7th, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about the paper. But again, very brief, 3 to 5 pages. Shouldn't take you too terribly long to write the paper. I have communicated with a couple of folks about potential problems that they want to write about and provide them feedback. Again, if you're kind of on the fence in terms of what problem or issue you want to use, just feel free to send me an email and bounce the idea off me, and I'm happy to give you some feedback as to whether or not I think it would work. But for the most part, if it's a problem that you've identified in your organization, 99.99% of the time, it's going to work for the background paper and the future papers coming up in this course. So usually it's really wide open for you. It really depends on your organization and some of the problems that your organization may be facing. Carol, go ahead.
Does the problem in our organization, does the problem need to be in our organization, or can we pick an organization?
You can certainly pick another organization. That's completely up to you. You know, most people write about problems in their organization, but you're free to write about another organization's problems, and that's absolutely fine.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. For tonight, what we're going to do again is talk about some differences between public and private organizations, but kind of go beyond where you've gone with this topic in the past. I know in MPA programs, and you're pretty far along now in this MPA program. You're about a year or so into this program. I know that at multiple times in multiple courses, you've talked about differences between public and private sector organizations, and I do realize that. So some of this will be a review for you. But what I want to do is tonight look at those differences in conjunction with the idea of effectiveness and talk about what those differences truly mean for how we define and measure effectiveness in public versus private sector organizations. So the way I've envisioned tonight is how I do most of my class sessions. First half of the class, we'll cover the material, discuss differences and how we can identify those differences and what they mean for effectiveness. Do a brief discussion about our good old friend Graham Allison and his article that you read for this week. Then we'll take a break, and then we will go ahead after the break, into our breakout groups. And I've got a little exercise that we'll do in our breakout groups that will then allow you to do your Canvas essay number 2 for next week. I'm sorry, I see some folks are having problems logging in tonight. So fortunately, everything's going to be recorded, and so if anyone's late coming in, the recording will be available there. It does, take a while for me to make the recording available. You probably noticed that it wasn't really available in the full version until Tuesday morning, and that's because of the adding of subtitles. Now, I do it through YouTube, and if you've ever loaded videos through YouTube and used the subtitle feature, those subtitles, that closed captioning, takes several hours, sometimes up to 12 hours for it to process. So that's why you may not see the video available till tomorrow morning, but it will be there that you can watch throughout the week. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about some of these issues. Yeah, it's better in terms of getting into the session. It's better to use the link that I provide, the invitation I provided, and that's usually the best way to get in. They had just I've just added that Zoom link into Canvas just very recently, and so I think it might be still a little bit glitchy. So yeah, use that original invitation, that original link, and that should get you into all the sessions for the entire course. So as you know from your coverage of this topic in previous courses, there are some profound differences between public and private sector organizations. We know that the heart of those differences really deals with the purpose of a private organization versus the purpose of a public organization. At the very basic level, we know that private sector organizations are operational for the purpose of that bottom line, of generating that profit. And most public organizations, true public organizations, do not operate to make a profit. And so that lack of a bottom line in the public sector is certainly a major essential distinction between the two different sectors. But we also know that public organizations and public programs often exist because the private sector, for whatever reason, fails to provide and or produce that needed good or service. So there's some needed good or service that's deemed necessary by society, typically, we usually look to the private sector to provide these goods and services, but when the private sector fails to do so, oftentimes because there is not that profit incentive, that's when we tend to turn to public organizations and public programs. Now, you'll notice I said when the private sector fails to either provide or produce a good or service. I say provide and or produce for a reason. And you may have covered this in previous courses, but there's a difference between provision and production of goods and services. Provision is giving the resources that will make production possible. So in order to produce a good or service, there need to be some resources that make that production process possible. So we have to hire the employees, we have to pay the employees' salaries. We may have to do some outreach efforts to educate our citizens that these types of programs and these types of goods and services are actually available to them. So there are some resources that will make production possible. Giving those resources is what we consider to be the provision side of the equation. Production is then actually creating the good or service and delivering the good or service. So with an MPA program, obviously the provision will be the resources that make teaching possible. And so the resources that come in terms of tuition, or if it's a state-supported program, come from state appropriations or from grants or university endowments. All that money is considered to be the provision of the program. Then the production is what's going on here on Monday evenings, the actual transmission of the information through instruction. That's an important distinction between provision and production. It's a distinction that we're going to make several times in this class. So just kind of hold on to that. And then when you hear me say provision and or production, that's why I'm saying that, because you can have government involved in both. You could have government involved in the provision and then leave the production to the private sector, as you would do in your classic privatization and contracting out. You could have the private sector do both, and that would be a pure private type of good. You could have some situations where, and they're rare, but where the private sector provides the resources and government then does the production. That might be an example, such as if you have a concert promoter and that concert promoter wants to have security at the venue. That concert promoter may then hire local law enforcement officers to actually do the security and pay them to actually do that security. So the money's coming from the concert promoter from a private source, but then the actual production, the creation of that security service is being done by public officials. But again, that's kind of a rare type of situation. I'm sure in some of your previous courses, you've talked about these differences between what public goods are and what private goods are. And the primary distinction, as you know, between public and private goods is that with public goods typically are non-exhaustive and they're also non-excludable. That with a pure public good, you cannot exclude people from partaking in the benefits of that good, and you cannot use them up. So one person getting a benefit from a pure public good does not erode the ability of someone else also getting a benefit from that pure public good. So those are public goods, and those are things that we usually do leave to public organizations. The opposite is true for a pure private good. As you know, pure private goods are excludable and they are exhaustive. So, the candy bar that's produced, that's sold at the convenience store is a pure private good. It's made by the private sector, sold by the private sector. It is both excludable as well as exhaustible. If you don't have the money to pay for that candy bar, you're excluded from getting the benefits of consuming that candy bar. If you do consume that candy bar, it's used up. And so if there's only one candy bar, one person eats it, it's used up then for another person to get those benefits. So as we know, you've got those extreme opposites, pure public goods and pure private goods. But you also probably know that there's a gray area in between. And there are some goods that share both public and private components. And for those goods that are in that gray area between your polar opposites of pure public and pure private goods, Those are the types of goods where we tend to have debates about just how large, if any, the government's role should be in provision and production. So you think about a good in the middle that's called a toll good. And so a toll good is a good where it is excludable, but it's non-exhaustive. So the classic example is that toll road. You want to drive on the toll road, you pull up, you put your money in, the bar goes up, you drive through and you drive over that toll road. That's an excludable type of good, because if someone pulls up, they don't have the money to pay the toll, the arm doesn't go up, they're not allowed to drive on the toll road. But it's considered to be non-exhaustive because everyone who pays will eventually get a chance to drive on that road. You may have to wait for the person in front of you to get out of your way, but eventually everyone then can consume that road and get a benefit from that road as long as they pay for it. Then another type of good in the middle, in that gray area, is what we call our collective pool goods. And collective pool goods are the opposite of toll goods. So whereas the toll good was excludable and non-exhaustive, a collective pool good is, at least theoretically, non-excludable, but it is exhaustive. And so you think about things like natural resources. You know, natural resources, everyone should have access to that. So it should be non-excludable, but it is exhaustible because it does get used up over time. So that's what you call the collective pool good. Clearly, with toll goods and collective pool goods, that's where we oftentimes argue about the proper role of public organizations in the provision and or production of those types of toll and collective pool goods. So the type of good, whether it's a pure public good, a pure private good, a toll good, or a collective pool good, can have an impact upon whether or not government should be involved in the first place in the provision and or production of that good. With pure public goods, we don't argue a lot about it. We assume that governments will be involved in provision and or production. But sometimes there are goods that have some private sector components to them that we would normally think should be left to the private sector, but for profit reasons, the private sector chooses not to provide or produce that good. And so someone then has to step in and provide or produce that good, and that role then goes to public organizations. Some of these goods and services and programs that are being provided and produced by government organizations can also create what we call externalities. And I assume you've been introduced to the idea of externalities before. An externality is an unintended consequence. So in the creation of this widget, the widget factory up on the hill and creating the widget ends up, a byproduct of that process of creating the widget ends up being pollution of the river that runs behind the factory. The factory didn't start out trying to pollute the river, but the pollution comes as a byproduct, an unintended consequence of the creation of this widget. That's what we consider to be a negative externality. It's a negative unintended consequence. The problem with these negative unintended consequences is that there is not a market incentive for the company to clean up that pollution of that river, because there is no profit incentive associated with cleaning up that river. So government then must step in. Either the federal or state or local government must step in and make sure that river gets cleaned up, either by compelling the company to clean the river or by issuing fines and charging the company for the amount of pollution that the company is creating. But whenever you have those negative externalities, that then again suggests for us a role for public organizations to play in provision and or production. But as we know, also with those negative externalities also come the potential for positive externalities as well. So positive consequences that are actually good for society as a whole. So a classic example here could be a childhood immunization program. And so you've got this childhood immunization program. The children who are actually participating in the immunization program are the direct beneficiaries. They're actually getting a direct benefit from it. But in theory, if they're participating in this immunization program, then it may reduce the likelihood that other people in society are going to get sick. These other people in society are not directly participating, but they are gaining a benefit from this immunization program. those individuals in society who are gaining a benefit without really shouldering the cost, those people are referred to as free riders. So whenever you have those positive externalities, it creates these free riders, people who are not directly paying for a good or service, but are nonetheless getting a benefit from it. And when you have those types of effects, we call those obviously spillover effects. Those spillover effects then are very hard to capture in your typical private sector corporation profit-making model. Because those people who are getting, those free riders who are getting benefits but not paying for the service, those individuals are going to demand more because they're getting a benefit, but their demand is not going to be reflected in the normal supply and demand curve because they're not directly purchasing it. They're just getting a benefit from it without purchasing it. So whenever you have those spillover effects, that then recommends to us, again, a role for public organizations to play in regulating the production of those types of goods and services that create those externalities, those spillovers. So when you have negative spillovers, like negative externalities like what you have with pollution, the role for government is to come in and try and limit that negative externality. Again, by setting quotas on how much pollution can be produced, or by charging corporations for the production of that pollution. With positive types of externalities, there's again a role for government to play, but it's the opposite role. So when government comes in sometimes with these positive externalities, it's not a role to limit the creation of the good that's resulting in that externality, but instead to enhance the creation of that good to create even more positive spillover effects that will benefit society as a whole. So sometimes government will come in and subsidize the production of some type of a good in order to induce whomever is creating that good to create larger quantities of that good to therefore create larger amounts of those positive externalities. So the reason why we do have public organizations to begin with and public programs to begin with is oftentimes to address market failures, sometimes to address these externalities and these spillover effects. So those are kind of economic models to help us explain why we have public organizations and public involvement in provision and production of goods and services. Another explanation is a political explanation, and that's what we call expectancy theory. So once government gets involved, people then expect government to continue getting involved. Once government has gotten involved and provided a service or provided a good to citizens, citizens tend to want to keep seeing that good or that service, which then ends up giving us this incline in terms of government intervention. Usually governments will get involved in order to try and mitigate some type of a crisis, and you would think once that crisis is over, then government intervention would go back to its normal level, but it usually doesn't. It stays at that heightened level because of expectancy theory. William, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to see exactly with everything that you're saying, because obviously we're talking a lot about money. It's my understanding that right now California is trying to tax people that are producing their own solar power here at their homes. And I just wanted to see where will that fall, because what kind of services the state government providing in order to start taxing for that when it's just collection of solar power?
Yeah, I think the problem with that type of initiative is that you then have the depressive effect on people, moving more into solar. If you really want to entice people to move more towards solar energy, and then if you start taxing people who are doing that, I think you're going to have that, depressing effect on people moving in that direction. So I think that probably is not going to happen, primarily for that reason. Is just because, if you want to foster solar energy production, this is a good way to not foster it, but it's a good way to actually slow it down. And so I think that would just be that negative effect that probably would keep it from happening on a broad scale. We do a lot of things in the tax code in order to encourage citizens to take certain types of actions. If you do your taxes, if you itemize, the biggest itemized deduction you can currently have in the federal income tax system is that mortgage interest deduction. And so if you have a mortgage, you can deduct the interest that you pay on that mortgage every year. Well, obviously, the reason for that type of deduction is we want to try and induce people to buy homes. We think that's a good thing for people to do. It's good for the economy. It's good for a lot of social reasons. And so we have that type of a deduction built into the federal tax system. The idea goes, if you take that deduction away, you may see an erosion in terms of home ownership rates. Same type of thing with charitable donations. You can deduct charitable donations, and by doing so, the federal government is really encouraging you to give to charities. If that deduction wasn't there, you might see a real nosedive in terms of the donations to charitable organizations. And so the tax code is something we use a lot in order to try and induce certain types of behaviors. And I think the state government's going to want to try and induce people to engage in the production of solar power, as opposed to try and move them away from that type of an activity. So it's really fascinating to see, and you've probably talked about tax codes before, and you've probably talked about it if you talk about budgeting and finance, but it's really fascinating all the different ways in which you can use the tax code to really shape and mold the behavior of taxpayers. So we know we've got these justifications for why we have public organizations, why we have governments delivering these public programs. We also know that a major difference between public and private sectors are the values that public and private sector organizations are predicated upon. Again, we know that with the private sector, where our values are primarily things like efficiency, trying to generate the largest profit possible so that we can push some of these profits toward our shareholders to make the company a little bit more profitable, make the company more attractive to investors, so we can bring in more investments and have more capital to work with in order to grow and diversify our corporations. So it's very much an efficiency type of basis. But as you all know, as public administrators in the public sector, we have a lot of other values that we are interested in as well. Hopefully, efficiency is still one of the values we're interested in the public sector. We will talk tonight about why efficiency sometimes can be difficult because of the sources of revenue flowing into government coffers as opposed to the sources of revenue that corporations rely upon. But hopefully, we're still concerned about efficiency. Clearly, we're concerned about effectiveness. I mean, after all, you have an entire course here based upon trying to promote and enhance effectiveness in the public sector. So clearly, effectiveness is one of our major values. Social equity is another major value we really emphasize in the public sector, perhaps a bit more so than what we see in the private sector. You may, when you talked about the development of the discipline of public administration in the past, you may have talked about new public administration, the new public administration movement from George Frederickson and others, where social equity has really become a primary value in the discipline of public administration. The protection of individual rights, another major value in public administration. We're very concerned about treating people equally. And when we interact with our citizens, making sure we do so in a way where we are not violating their constitutional rights. There's no longer sovereign immunity for government employees. Those days are gone. There is, though, what's called qualified good faith immunity. Qualified good faith immunity essentially says that if you are operating in good faith in the course of doing your job and the functions of your job, then you have some protection in terms of the steps and the actions that you take. But it's qualified. And that, you can't just say, I work for a government, so therefore I'm immune from prosecution. What you do have to do under qualified good faith immunity is you have to be aware of the constitutional rights of those individuals you are dealing with, and then endeavor not to violate those constitutional rights, because the protection of those individual rights is a major value that underpins public organizations. We know we operate in a political environment. We'll talk more about that tonight. We'll spend next week talking about the political environment of public administration and what that means for effectiveness. But when we deal in this political environment, we realize that we have to be responsive to political entities. Our budgets will be coming from elected officials, and so therefore we have to be responsive to the concerns and the questions that we get from those elected officials. Woodrow Wilson, which is probably one of the first articles that you read in the MPA program. Woodrow Wilson made the argument that when he even talked about the politics, administration, economy, that politics serve as the touchstone of administration. And so whatever types of administrative reforms we want to try and start and implement, we always have to remember that those reforms always need to work for our unique political culture. We always have to remember that politics will always be that touchstone we have to go to in public administration. And so we've got all these additional values, if we will, that we may not necessarily worry about that much in private sector organizations. When the public sector gets involved in the provision and or the production of a good or service, what is happening is public resources are supplanting private sector resources. So typically, if you left this good or service to the private sector would put private sector resources toward the production and the provision. When government gets involved, you are then displacing what may be private sector resources. If the private sector was willing to do it and you didn't have market failures, you would be supplanting those private sector resources with public sector resources. So public managers need to know that there is a standard placed upon them in terms of the goods and services they are producing, and that they need to produce goods and services that will deliver a benefit to our citizens that will outweigh the cost of producing that good or that service. If the benefits that people are getting from a good or service do not at least equal or exceed the cost of producing that good or service, then obviously we're going to have major issues for efficiency as well as major issues for effectiveness, because we are not meeting the needs of those citizens who are consuming those goods and those services. But we need to remember, when we're talking about benefits, we're not just talking about monetary benefits. We're talking about benefits in terms of social equity and benefits in terms of protection of individual rights and benefits in terms of political responsiveness, representative bureaucracy, and all these other values that we deal with in the public sector. So when we are measuring success in the public sector, it's certainly not all about efficiency. Efficiency is one value, but it's one value that is balanced against all these other values that we need to be concerned with as public managers, as we try and make our organizations effective and successful organizations. So that's kind of just a framework then for then getting into this discussion of some of these differences between public and private organizations. And I think we do ourselves a bit of disservice when we present this as a binary type of situation, as a dichotomy, where we say either an organization is public or the organization is private. There really are gradations in between. And I like this chart on the screen now because I think it kind of shows you some of those gradations. So on the private side, you start obviously at the top right-hand corner of the chart. For the public side, you're at the bottom left-hand. And as you move on the top side of the chart from right to left, you move from a pure private type of enterprise to private organizations that are still private, but a little bit less so. So you go from a pure private enterprise to a private corporation that's subject to general government regulations, such as affirmative action, OSHA types of requirements. Then you can move to a private corporation that gets a significant but not majority of its funding from government contracts. They're obviously going to be more quasi-governmental in nature. Heavily regulated firms like privately owned utilities. Then you move on to private corporations. They get a majority of their revenue from government contracts, which then is going to make them very heavily regulated in terms of what they do. And they will oftentimes be almost as regulated as a public sector organization. Pure private nonprofit organizations that get their funding from government contracts. Move down to the bottom right. Government programs or agencies operated largely through purchase from private vendors. And so government programs such as Medicare and public housing that operate within the market, making their purchases in the market itself. Then you have government sponsored enterprises that are established by government, but with shares that are traded on the stock exchange. Then state-owned enterprises or public corporations like the Postal Service, the Tennessee Valley Authority, port authorities. And then finally, the far left on the bottom, a true, pure government agency, a bureau, a department, an agency that's truly owned and operated by the public sector. So it's not just private enterprise versus government agency. There are actually all these different gradations in terms of this publicness argument of how public or how private an organization is. Another way we can look at the differences between public and private organizations is by comparing them on the basis of who owns the organization and who funds the organization. So in the top left-hand cell, you have a pure public organization, public ownership, and public funding. So it's owned by government and it's funded by taxes or government contracts. So Department of Defense, Social Security Administration, most police departments, those are your more pure public types of organizations. Bottom right, your more pure private organizations like General Motors, IBM, General Electric, privately owned, also privately funded, getting their money not from taxes or necessarily a majority from contracts, but getting their money from sales and from private donations. Then your mixture, the top right hand of the screen, you've got private ownership and you have public funding. So things like defense contractors, RAND Corporation, these private firms that get a lot of their revenue from government contracts. Then the bottom left, you have your publicly owned but privately funded organizations, oftentimes things like government corporations like the U.S. Postal Service, government-owned utilities, FHLB's board, those types of organizations that are still public, but they generate their own revenue through these market activities, through sales, and can actually run a profit. The U.S. Postal Service as a public corporation can run a profit. It's allowed to run a profit. The problem is that it just rarely does so. And so it always has to go then back to Congress and ask for additional funding, especially for capital improvements, because it's not generating enough through sales to make those types of capital improvements. So that's another way of looking at who owns it versus who funds it. Another way of looking at differences between public and private organizations is to compare them in terms of where the authority comes from, where the authority for their existence and their operations, where does that authority come from? Does it emanate from a political source or does it emanate from an economic source? So here you have your simple X and Y axis. The Y axis is economic authority. The higher you are on the Y axis, the more private you are. The lower you are, the less private you are. Then along your X axis, you have political authority. The further you are to the left, the more private you are. The further you are to the right, the more public you are. So government agencies at the bottom right, very high on political authority, very low on economic authority. Private firms, far left, at the top of the screen, very high on economic authority, obviously very low on political authority. And then you can see all the different types of organizations and where they are arrayed based upon their reliance upon either economic or political types of authority. So this is, again, another way of distinguishing between public and private sector organizations. But again, the whole idea is to underscore this idea that there are a lot of gradations. It's not just a binary yes or no. There are a lot of distinctions. And organizations can look a lot different in that gray area between the polar extremes of a pure public and a pure private type of organization. Another way to look at it in this screen, the same type of thing, looking at ownership versus funding versus what's called mode of social control. This is just another element of authority. Under mode of social control, either it's controlled by society, is in a polyarchy, or it's controlled by market forces. And so you can see how all these different types of organizations array on the chart based upon who owns them, who funds them, and who has authority over them. And then in the far right-hand column, you can see some examples of each of those different types of organizations. But again, not to belabor the point, but just to again show you that there are a lot of gradations in between when we compare public versus private types of organizations. Now, when you did your reading for this week, one of the articles that you read was Graham Allison's article. And in Graham Allison's article, Allison looks at this question of similarities and differences between public and private organizations. Now, public and private sectors fundamentally alike in all unimportant aspects. So when you read the Graham Allison article, what was your number one takeaway from the Graham Allison article? What do you think the primary moral of the story, if you will, was in the Graham Allison article? What does Allison tell us in terms of similarities and differences between public and private organizations and public and private management? Are they similar? Are they different? Is the answer yes to both of those?
Excuse me. I think a point he's making there is that there are both similarities and differences, but perhaps the differences aren't quite as pronounced and as startling as some common assumptions will have us believe, and that the similarities between private and public can be greater than, for example, similarities between a very small and a very large public agency. So it's kind of, he's kind of undermining the assumption there that it's a dichotomous.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. He says, in terms of similarities and differences, are there similarities? Are there differences? Yes and yes. There are similarities and there are differences. But when we talk about, well, the public sector is completely different than the private sector, I think Allison certainly takes issue to that. And he says, really, there are some things that are very similar between the two different types of organizations, but there are some differences as well. The similarities, Allison argues, goes back to that generic management theory that we presented in class last week. The generic management theory says that all organizations, whether it's a government or a private organization, all organizations will engage in similar types of management functions. So all organizations are going to engage in staffing. You have to hire employees, onboard those employees, train those employees. You have to engage in what we call work allocation, in that you have to divide up the tasks between those employees. We have to evaluate the performance of those employees, apply rewards or penalties based upon those levels of performance. So this HR, this staffing function, goes on in both public as well as private organizations. The budgeting and finance function goes on in both public and private organizations. Both types of organizations have to generate resources. They don't get the resources, they don't have the money. Money is the lifeblood of an organization, as Stuart Long tells us. And so if we don't have money, we can't run our organizations. Now, there's a classic example of that back in 1996, when I teach the Intergovernmental Relations course. We talk about this organization that used to be known as the United States Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, otherwise known as USACIR. And the ACIR had been around for decades. And the primary purpose of the ACIR was to do research on issues of intergovernmental relations and how different levels of governments get along and the patterns of those relationships. It really produced dozens upon dozens of really good studies, good peer-reviewed research every single year on intergovernmental relations. In 1996, in fiscal year 1996, Congress decided to do what it called zero out the organization. When Congress zeroes out an organization, it takes its complete appropriations away from it. And so USACIR went down to a budget of zero in 1996. But when it lost its appropriations, it had to shutter its doors. It could no longer pay for these contracts. It could no longer afford the lease in the private sector building that it was leasing space in. Just overnight went out of business. And that's an example of zeroing out. That's an example of how an organization can go away in the public sector immediately if it loses its appropriations. Usually for a private sector corporation, it's kind of a longer process in terms of losing your resources, in that you tend to lose your resources over time as your sales go down. You then have to lay people off. You then have to downsize. And it takes kind of a while before that corporation goes out of existence. A good question. Angelica asked, well, what were some of the politics behind it? That's a really good question. The politics behind it are basically in 1995, the ACIR did a study. And I actually participated in the study. I was one of the PIs on part of the study. And what the ACIR did is it was looking at the fiscal and programmatic impacts of different types of congressional laws, different types of laws passed by Congress, those impacts upon state and local governments. My little piece of the puzzle was I was looking at the impacts of the Americans with Disabilities Act on local education agencies. And what ACI wanted to see is, are there a lot of costs associated with these federal pieces of legislation that are essentially unfunded mandates, whereby the state and local governments are not getting reimbursed for a lot of these costs that are coming from these federal laws. So that then resulted in a draft report that the commissioners reviewed in late 1995. And the draft report really called out a lot of these pieces of legislation as congressional overreach. Now, not the ADA, but some other ones as being congressional overreach, where Congress was imposing limitations upon state and local governments without reimbursing them for the cost of those types of actions they're required to take. Congress got a hold of that draft report. And remember, it was a draft report. So the commissioners had not approved it. It was just a draft report. Congress got a hold of that report. Congress obviously did not like that report. Both parties didn't like it because it made Congress look bad. And it called for either getting rid of or greatly modifying a lot of pieces of legislation that were really returning some benefits politically for members of Congress. So Congress then decided as a result of that just to shut down the ACIR and take their funding away. So that's the reason why ACIR lost its funding and went out of business. Yeah, it's there's a great book if you're interested. It's an old book, but it's still a good one by David Mayhew. It was written back in 1970s, I believe, 1974, I think, but it's still true today. It's called Congress, the Electoral Connection. And Mayhew's major premise in that book is that everything that members of Congress do, or the majority of things members of Congress do, those things are being done for a re-election motive. That what they do is they do casework for constituents in order to get reelected. They advertise their name in order to increase their name recognition to get reelected. They take non-controversial positions on non-controversial issues in order to, again, try and curry favor with voters to get reelected. They pass legislation that will deliver benefits to their districts, sometimes not for the benefit of the district, but rather that they can attach their name to it. And so, this is a common practice among members of Congress is just before an election, you'll get a newsletter from your member of Congress extolling all their virtues and all these projects and all these jobs they brought back to their district so they can claim credit for things, again, in order to enhance their reelection prospects. And so, yes, Congress has a major reelection motivation. That draft report from the ACIR did not really fit very well with a lot of their reelection motives. Not really in terms of getting reelected. I mean, if what you are doing, you're doing legally through the legislation process, you're not taking bribes, you're not unduly exerting influence on individuals. No, unfortunately, it's just kind of
I was just curious, only because it's essentially pulling the strings on federal funding. And I didn't know if that was something that essentially they have carte blanche, or if it's something that there are limitations that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, Amber, and it's something that we normally would wonder. Well, can this be done? It can, as long as Congress is spending money through the normal appropriations process or something that looks like the normal appropriations process, then they are in line with the Constitution. Now, the Constitution has an appropriations clause that says that before Congress can spend any money, it must first appropriate that money. So before money can come out of the U.S. Treasury, that money must first be appropriated. And appropriation is just the process by which Congress says, this is what we're spending money on, and this is how much money we're spending on these different things. So as long as they're appropriating that money through that appropriations process, this type of pork barrel type of spending happens all the time, and it's very common. Now, the problem with the budgeting process in Congress is that it's not done the way in which it's supposed to be done. If you're familiar with the way in which budgeting works at the federal level, you basically have two different types of spending. You have discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is the spending that Congress has direct control over. And so it's something that's discretionary spending. Congress, like the ACAR, was discretionary spending. Congress could go in and say, nope, we're going to zero that out. We want that organization to go away. They had the legal ability to do that. But the other category of spending is what's called mandatory spending. And so mandatory spending is going to be things such as interest on the national debt. When Congress borrows money, Congress has to repay that money, principal and interest. So those interest payments, they're beyond the control of Congress. They must make those payments or they're going to default on their debt. Another type of mandatory spending is spending on entitlement programs. Entitlement programs, eligibility-based programs, Congress cannot directly reduce spending on those eligibility-based programs unless they change the eligibility requirements. So if Congress wants to spend less on Social Security, Congress would have to change the eligibility requirements, maybe increase the retirement age so fewer people are eligible for those Social Security payments. So mandatory spending goes through what we call an authorizations process. Discretionary spending goes through the normal appropriations process. So things like ACAR, that was discretionary spending through the appropriations process. Congress will pass appropriation bills. So they'll have 12 different appropriation bills, a different bill for each different area of spending. So you'll have a Veterans Affairs appropriations bill. You'll have a Health and Human Services bill, an agriculture bill, an education bill. If Congress doesn't get all those appropriation bills passed by the end of the fiscal year, by September 30th, and signed by the president for the beginning of the new federal fiscal year on October 1st, that's when Congress has a problem. All those areas where the appropriation bills have not yet been passed, there is no authorization for those agencies in the new fiscal year to go out there and spend money. So what Congress will then do is, for all those unpassed appropriation bills, they'll pass continuing resolutions and buy themselves 2 or 3 or 4 weeks in order to get all the appropriation bills done. That never happens. I can see that with certainty over the past several years, that has not happened. They cannot come to agreement on all 12 of those appropriation bills. So instead, what they do is, down around December or January, they will take all those unpassed appropriation bills and they'll throw them all together into this huge piece of legislation known as an OBRA. And an OBRA stands for an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. So all those unpassed appropriation bills go into an OBRA. Congress then passes this OBRA that will be thousands upon thousands of pages long. Members of Congress don't know what is in the OBRA until sometimes 2 or 3 weeks later, because everyone's throwing their own pet project into the OBRA. And you have to allow those pet projects to go in there in order to get those members of Congress to support the passage of the OBRA. So by doing budgeting this way, through Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Acts, as opposed to individual appropriation bills, that's how you end up with a lot of your overspending. That's how you end up with a lot of this pork barrel spending. This is what happens when you end up with, a lot of these, $600 toilet seats at the Pentagon that we hear so much about. That comes out of these Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Acts. And that's true. Like Amber says, you have to pass it to find out what's in it. And that's exactly what they do. And then we go through with a fine-tooth comb for 2 or 3 weeks to figure out what we actually passed and what we're actually spending money on. I think you make a compelling argument. That's no way to run a government, but that's the way we do our budgeting at the federal level. And so when you got an OBRA, it's the perfect vehicle for members to enhance their reelection prospects by getting their individual pet projects thrown into that OBRA. Now, that's where you get bridges that are named after your member of Congress. You get parts of highways that are named after your member of Congress. That's where a lot of those types of projects come from. So those sources of revenue for organizations are going to be coming from those types of appropriations. And if you don't have the appropriations, you don't have the money, obviously you then go out of existence. So when we are looking at these public and these private sector organizations, as Allison tells us, everyone does budgeting, but some organizations in the public sector do budgeting differently than the way in which it's done in the private sector. So staffing, budgeting, those are all done by both sectors, just done differently. Strategic planning is done differently in the private sector than in the public sector. There can be a lot more individuals and groups involved in strategic planning in the public sector than what you have in the private sector. So you both do strategic planning, is do it different. In terms of interacting with your environment, you interact with your environment differently in the public than the private sector. Your environment's much more political in the public sector. You have interest groups, you have constituents that you don't necessarily have those same type of influences in the private sector. The media scrutiny is obviously going to be much more profound in the public sector than it is in the private sector, but you still have to do in both sectors. You still have to be concerned about PR, if you will, in both sectors. So I think the moral of the story Allison is telling us is that, yes, public and private organizations are certainly similar, but they're similar in terms of these generic management activities. So what they do is similar. The difference, though, is in how they do it. And how it's done in the public sector is different than how it is done in the private sector. So I think his answer to the title of his article, Are Public and Private Organizations Similar in All Unimportant Aspects? I think he's getting at, yes, they are similar, but when it really gets down to the important environment in which they're doing these things and the way in which they're doing these things, it's the how that really sets public organizations apart from private sector organizations. So let's pick up on that conclusion from Allison and talk about it a little bit more specifically. So Allison tells us the environment in which public organizations operate will be a different type of environment in which private sector organizations operate. Well, we've already talked about one of those environmental influences will be where the revenues come from. Private sector organizations have these market influences and that their money is going to be coming from sales. And so they have some direct control over that stream of revenue. In the public sector, revenue is going to probably be coming from appropriations. So those appropriations are going to come from elected officials, from political bodies. So you may not have the same amount of control over those revenues. But the good thing in public organizations is those appropriations tend to be a lot more stable than sales revenue will be for a private corporation. If you're a private corporation and you're selling this good and another corporation comes out with a similar good, only better than yours, your sales are going to plummet. And when your sales plummet, you don't have revenue to operate. In the public sector, unless you get zeroed out like the ACAR did because of political reasons, chances are you're going to get a similar amount of appropriations next year as to what you got this year, maybe with a slight augmentation of 1 or 2 or 3%. Now that's, as you know, is what's called incrementalism. And we're very incremental in the way in which we do budgeting. So appropriations tend to be more stable than revenue coming from sales in the private sector. Those appropriations, again, because they're coming from government appropriations and not from sales, do not really give you an idea of consumer preferences. It's hard for you to know what the preferences are of your consumers because those preferences are not being reflected in how much you are, quote unquote, selling like you would in the private sector. So because your appropriations are more stable, because your appropriations don't really reflect consumer preferences and these types of market influences you normally see in the private sector, the argument goes is that there's not as much of an imperative on trying to be efficient in the public sector as compared to the private sector. And we'll explore whether or not that's true in a couple of slides. But that's usually the perception, is that because of the source of revenue, public sector organizations tend not to value efficiency as much as their private sector counterparts. Again, keeping with environmental factors, as Graham Allison tells us, you've got a lot more masters, if you will, that you serve in the public sector as compared to the private sector. Public sector administrators, public organizations serve many masters. You have legislative masters, you have executive masters, you have judicial masters. All of these constraints that you get through legislation passed by Congress, executive orders and directives that are promulgated by the executive branch, sometimes consent decrees and structural remedies and all these devices used by the judiciary, those provide more constraints and limitations in terms of how you do what you do in your organization. And those types of administrative controls tend to proliferate over the years and end up causing what we call in public administration institutional rigidity. As organizations get older, they get more external rules and requirements. They also develop their own internal rules and requirements as well. And as an organization ages, all those external and internal rules and requirements end up making for a very institutionally rigid type of organization. So the environment is certainly going to be different. We also know that we have to deal with media, we have to worry about public opinion, we have to worry about interest group lobbying, pressures from constituents and client groups. There's a greater diversity and intensity of those external types of political influences placed upon public organizations that are oftentimes placed upon private organizations. And so you've got a lot more of those types of influences coming from your environment. So your environment is obviously more political. Your environment is also much more varied and much more heterogeneous than it might otherwise be in the private sector. We know that the way in which the organization interacts with its environment may be different in the public sector versus a pure private sector organization. We know that public organizations managers are involved in the production of public goods or the handling of externalities. Whenever you have these externalities and these spillovers, or you have goods that you are creating that are not readily measurable by market forces, it becomes a little bit more difficult for you to know how much to produce and what types of goods and services you should be producing. We also know that because government organizations score very high on political authority, it means that there is this coercive power that emanates from government that the private sector does not have. And so you've got this coercive authority sometimes from government that creates a monopolistic type of situation where government is the only entity that is producing this type of a good or service. So there's not that competition. It's government, and government is the only game in town. In addition to having government monopolies, there are also what are called government monopsonies. A government monopoly is where government is the sole producer. A government monopsony is where government is the sole consumer. And so, for instance, when I was on the school board, there are some types of things that only public schools really tend to use or really are allowed to use. And so we're the only consumer of those types of things. There aren't a whole lot of other private sector consumers, and that would be what we call a government monopsony. So, in terms of being producers and consumers, they could be the only game in town as a government organization, as opposed to all the competition that you normally see in the private sector. What we do in the public sector also tends to have a lot of symbolic influence, a lot of symbolic significance, in that oftentimes what we do is held up kind of as, this is for society, this is a societal good, which has a greater scope of influence than perhaps creating one type of a good as a private sector corporation. We know public managers are under a lot more scrutiny typically than private sector managers. Years ago, I know NBC always had this segment on Friday evenings in their national news broadcast called The Fleecing of America. And they would pick one government agency or one government program that they thought was fleecing America, one government organization or agency that was spending millions upon millions of dollars on a program that really didn't contribute anything to society, at least in the eyes of NBC News. And one of their examples was a federal grant program where the federal government had partnered with Michigan State University. And the purpose of the program was to study the impact of cow flatulence on the atmosphere and on the ozone layer. That was one of their examples of fleecing of America. Now, it may be very important because, cow flatulence certainly does contribute to it. It can contribute to degradation of the ozone layer, but NBC News found that to be fleecing of America and really tried to, quote unquote, expose that in their evening broadcast. So there's a lot of this scrutiny of public managers. There are expectations for public managers to be fair, responsive, honest, open, and accountable. Here, we're in California, and if you work with a city council or you work with a local school board or some state type of agency, the impacts of the Brown Act, and we're very big on sunshine laws here in California, where our meetings have to be conducted in the open. And at the very tail end of my time on the school board was during the early time of COVID, and it's when we had to we didn't close schools, but we transitioned from in-person to virtual learning, and we then had to transition from in-person board meetings to virtual board meetings. And the governor issued an executive order loosening the requirements of the Brown Act to allow us to conduct our meetings online, and then had requirements for how those online meetings would have to be conducted. But we still had to have this, opportunity for the public to comment. You still had to have your agendas published at least 72 hours in advance. You had to have all these types of accountability and transparency and openness types of requirements. So California is one of those states really at the forefront of the sunshine laws and transparency and openness. Much more obviously in the public sector than what you'd have in the private sector. As a public official, you may have to file a conflict of interest form, disclose any possible conflict of interest you may have if you are in a reporting type of position, a Form 700. Again, something you don't have to do in a private sector organization necessarily. We know in the public sector, we do goal setting just like you do in the private sector, but we know in the public sector, our goals tend to be more ambiguous. They tend to be more multiple in nature. And when you have multiple goals, those goals tend to conflict with each other. When you have multiple conflicting goals, obviously that's going to make it hard for you to be effective under the goal attainment model. And a lot of you, when you talked in your Canvas essays this week, you talked about the goal attainment model, and you defined effectiveness as the ability of the organization to achieve its goals. And the goal attainment model is the most common model of organizational effectiveness. But if your goals are not clear, if your goals are multiple and conflicting, it's going to be difficult for you to be effective in the perspective of a goal attainment type of model. Studies have really kind of given us different conclusions in terms of the effectiveness of public organizations across a lot of these different dimensions. A lot of studies have shown us that the roles of public managers tend to be what we call very expository types of roles, in that they're kind of positions that demonstrate to society and kind of signal to society what is important, more so than perhaps a private sector type of role in a private sector organization. Our roles as public sector managers tend to certainly be much more political in nature. There are a lot more interventions that we have to deal with as public managers than private managers. We have to take time out for a lot of these fire drills that are created where we have to go in and manage these crisis situations. A lot of times these crisis situations are created from a political source. So it's an elected body of elected officials that create this crisis that we as public managers then have to go in and address that crisis. And those fire drills certainly can upset a lot of the normal management functions that we engage in, more so than they would upset what goes on in a private organization. Public managers tend to have less decision-making autonomy and less flexibility because of all of these external political constraints and institutional constraints. Serving many masters means that you're not going to have the same autonomy and flexibility that you may have in the private sector. Yes, public managers also staff just like private sector managers, but we have less control over our subordinates. We have less control over our subordinates because of civil service regulations. We have less control because of collective bargaining agreement stipulations. We have less control over how we do purchasing and procurement, how we put out requests for proposals, RFPs, and then how we have to assess those bids in a competitive bidding process. Back when I taught an undergraduate version of the Intro to Public Administration course, this was many, many years ago, long before former President Trump became president, but I used the example of the ice rink in Central Park in New York City as one of these examples of the differences between public and private organizations. And for years, New York City was trying to get this ice rink renovated. They were always running behind schedule. They were always running over budget, and the projects just were not getting done. And so Donald Trump then stepped in and said, as a private contractor, I'll take over the project and I'll get the project done. He was able to get the project done. He was able to bring it in under budget. But the reason for that was primarily because he did not have to abide by a lot of the same requirements that New York City did. When New York City then contracted with Donald Trump to do this, they waived a lot of the normal requirements in terms of competitive bidding, in terms of the vetting of subcontractors, turned a lot of that over and just kind of waived all that and said, go and do what you normally do. So Donald Trump was able to hire the contractors that he wanted, the subcontractors that he wanted. There was no bidding process involved. Contractors and subcontractors knew that if they didn't do a good job on this ice rink, then they probably would not get any other jobs with the Trump organization. And so they were very willing to get jobs done on time and high quality of work. It just kind of illustrates some of the differences in terms of how quickly you can act and react in the private sector as compared to the public sector. And so, those constraints, you think about competitive bidding. If you are ever involved in competitive bidding in the public sector, you know that the competitive bidding process is required for certain types of projects over a certain threshold amount. You have to put out an RFP, you have to solicit bids, the bids come in as sealed bids. You then have to advertise the date and the time in which those sealed bids are going to be open. The contractors are allowed to attend the opening of those sealed bids. You open up the bids and then you award the lowest bid that is both what we call responsible and responsive. So the bidder has to be fiscally responsible, which means the bidder has to be registered with the state, have their license with the DIR, the Department of Industrial Relations. All the subcontractors that they have identified in their proposal all must be bonded and must be registered with the California DIR. That means that they are a responsible bidder. The bid itself has to be responsive, meaning that it has to speak to all the parts of the request for project, the RFP. And if there's something that bid does not respond to in the RFP, it's no longer considered a responsive bid, and that bid can then be rejected. Well, you can assume how bidders are going to react if their bids are rejected. So if you've got the lowest bid, you think you're the one that should be selected, and then the government rejects that bid, you can then appeal that bid rejection, and then there's a whole appeals process that has to be initiated. Amber, go ahead.
Just in my experience working at the county behavioral wellness, or the county of Santa Barbara Department of Behavioral Wellness, and doing RFPs, I find that a lot of it has to do also with the funding source and the federal funds, and that's the reason that a lot of these thresholds exist for the possibility of sole sourcing it is difficult, because you have to show that they're unique in certain ways. Otherwise, appeals could lead to legal action because of the state laws that also apply to the public entities. So I guess it's kind of a combination of both the laws and the funding, I guess is my question, but I'm not sure about your experience working with RFPs.
Yeah, you're right. It depends upon the type of project that you're trying to contract out. It depends upon what the project is. It depends upon the type of government you are and the threshold 4-year level of government, as well as where the money is coming from. Is this federal money? Is it state money? Is it local money? Yeah, all that plays into the threshold at which you have to do competitive bidding as opposed to being able to do a negotiated bidding process. There's a waiver process that I know exists to allow you to waive that competitive bidding process in certain situations, and being able to negotiate do negotiated bidding, even if the statute says it should be competitively bidded. It really depends upon a lot of those things, like you said, the type of funding source, the type of project. Statute will lay out, for these up to this threshold, it must be competitively bid. And the competitive bidding process, like you said, it can lead to legal action. And I've seen that in a couple of situations, I'm sure you have as well, where a bidder has objected to their bid being denied, and then the bid appeal then comes to, for my situation, to the school board, and the bidder would the contractor would actually come to the meeting and would present their case at the meeting, and then the board would have to decide whether or not to uphold the appeal or reject the appeal. And the appeal is rejected, and if the bidder believes that it was rejected in violation of state law, then they can then bring legal action against the district or against the city. So it's a very complex process. It's a very time-consuming process, but it's a process that happens in the public sector that you're not necessarily going to see happen over in the private sector. So it's a great example of another constraint that is placed upon how we do the purchasing and procurement and all those good types of things. I'm sorry I missed Amber's comment in text chat about the County of Santa Barbara civil servants respond to state emergencies if activated. We have to be responsive. And so certainly what we do is not always within our own control. Being on a local school board, I know that local school boards as special purpose governments don't have a whole lot of control as compared to general purpose governments. So if you compare a school district to a city or county may be a general purpose government. They have a lot more control over what they do and how they do it, when they do it, as compared to a local school district. Local school district, whenever it wants to change its boundaries, it has to go through an approval process with the county committee on school district reorganization. It has to be approved through that county committee. Then it has to be approved through the county office of education. Then it has to be approved at the state level. And there are a lot of steps that you have to go through as a special purpose government. Again, not as much control over what you do and how you do it. Some studies have shown that public managers tend to be relatively reluctant to delegate authority. And I think that often comes from the idea that they have less authority to begin with. And so when they do have some type of authority, it's more difficult for them to relinquish that and to delegate that authority. A lot of turnover. We have a lot of turnover in the public sector. That's especially true when you have political appointees who are at the apex of the organizational structure. Those political appointees may be there for 18 to 24 months, and then they move on, and another political appointee comes in. You have administrations change, and administration will put in a new political appointee that may have a completely different opinion about the future of the organization than the political appointee who just left. So a lot of that type of turnover. We know city managers, sometimes city managers can turn over relatively quickly as well. And so you kind of lose that leadership relatively quickly in some cities. So some of these things, some of these constraints that we see in the public sector can make it more difficult for public sector managers to be entrepreneurial in nature because they just don't have the control that they need to be truly entrepreneurial. We know all about red tape. Yeah, and usually when you say the word bureaucracy and you do kind of a free association, you say bureaucracy, the first thing most people say is red tape. I always do that in my introductory course. I always say, okay, free association, I say bureaucracy. Red tape is always either the first or the second term that people respond with. We know there is red tape because you have all of these different regulations and all these different requirements that you need to abide by. The question is, does that red tape make a difference? And I think that the literature is kind of split on that. One person's red tape is another person's procedures that help protect individual rights. And so it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. But there are a lot of limitations, a lot of regulations, certainly in the public sector. We also know that strategic planning process functions differently in the public as compared to the private sector. There are more interruptions. It's more difficult for us to do strategic planning sometimes because of those fire drills and those crises that are oftentimes created by other sources as opposed to our own organization. Kind of difficult for us to get all the way through the strategic planning process. The old adage in strategic planning is if you're always planning, you're never doing. And a lot of organizations talk a lot about strategic planning. They'll have their strategic planning retreats, but then when they get back to the work of their normal business on a day-to-day basis, again, those interventions and those interruptions happen and make it difficult to carry through on those types of strategic plans. And again, I'm going to truncate some of this because I know we're running a little bit long with this, but we also know there's a big body of literature that looks at incentives and the provision of incentives to employees to try and enhance or augment production and performance. We know we have a lot more constraints on our ability in the public sector to use extrinsic as opposed to intrinsic incentives. It's more difficult for us to do pay for performance because we're oftentimes limited in our ability to do that. We also are very limited in our ability to promote people as a reward because their promotions oftentimes going to be tied to that position classification system. Where some organizations run into trouble is they will want to pay a well-performing employee more. And so what they will do is they will then reclassify their position so that they can reclassify their position into a higher level on the position classification chart and then compensate that person that higher amount. The problem with that is that once you reclassify that person in their position, then you're going to have other people who want their positions reclassified as well. And you kind of have that domino effect. And if you end up reclassifying all these positions, number one, it should be because the actual positions themselves and the requirements of the positions change. But number two, you may end up reclassifying dozens of positions within your organization, which is time consuming, can cost a lot of money, and can lead to a lot of that salary contraction that goes on within organizations. We also know the literature tells us that typically, because of these limitations on extrinsic types of incentives, that public employees tend to value intrinsic incentives more. And they tend to place a lower valuation on extrinsic incentives like monetary rewards than their private sector counterparts. The literature also tells us that sometimes there's a difference in satisfaction between public employees and private employees. And sometimes public managers have to work harder to enhance the satisfaction levels of their employees because they don't have many of those reward structures that private sector organizations do have. Later in the term, when we talk about motivation, we're going to look at employee engagement. We're going to look at employee satisfaction at the federal level. And I think what you will see is that it is true that federal employee satisfaction levels tend to be a little bit lower than in the private sector, but both levels are so high that it doesn't really make that much of a difference. And so whereas you might see a corporation have a 95% federal employee satisfaction level, you may see a 94% in the public sector. So private sector tends to be a little higher, but it's not a statistically significant difference between the two. But we'll talk about that when I show you that federal employee engagement summary in a few weeks. There's also the argument in the literature that because of all these limitations and constraints, public managers tend to be more cautious and less innovative than their private sector counterparts. And again, I think the evidence for that in the literature is a little bit mixed in that we do see examples of innovation and creativity in the public sector, but I think that still, since the public holds bureaucracies in such low regard, there's still that general perception out there that public employees are not nearly as proactive and innovative as their private sector counterparts. So essentially, we're agreeing with Allison, and we're saying, yes, Allison is right. A lot of the functions are similar types of functions between the two sectors, but the big difference is not in what they do, the big difference is in how they do it. And how they do these things is what has such a big impact then on the effectiveness of these public organizations. So what I would like to do in our second half of class, and we'll take a break before we do this, but after we come back from our break, I'm going to go ahead and break us up into breakout groups. I mean, we've got about 27 folks in, so I think we'll probably do, maybe we'll do about 4 or 5 breakout groups. And then what I want each group to do is to discuss your different organizations that you work for, organizations you're using for your assignments in this class, and come to an agreement on 2 to 3 common characteristics in your organizations that truly set your organizations apart from private sector organizations. So 2 to 3 things that really do make your organizations different. And then think about how those differences, how those characteristics do have an impact upon the effectiveness of your organizations. But let's go ahead and take a break now because it's almost 7:30. So let's take about a 15-minute break. We'll come back, we'll say at 7:40. When we come back at 7:40, I'll go ahead and break you up into breakout groups. We'll spend maybe half an hour or so in our breakout groups working on this exercise. We'll reconvene as a class and spend maybe about 5 or 10 minutes sharing out from our groups, what common characteristics you came up with, and see how many commonalities and how many differences we have between the responses from all of our different groups. So take a break until 7:40, come back, and then we'll do our breakout group session. Okay, welcome back. Hope you had a good break. Let's go ahead and do our breakout rooms now. So I'll go ahead and assign them. I guess we now have 26. So we'll do 4 breakout rooms. And so go ahead and set those up. Just automatically assign. And okay, I have them assigned, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms. Like I said, we'll spend maybe about 30 minutes or so working on this. So let's say we'll reconvene at 8:10, and I'll give you a little warning whenever I'm going to shut down the breakout rooms. Get together, reconvene as class at 8:10, and then we'll see what you came up with. And if you could, as you are working on this in your group, if each group could select one spokesperson, so then when we reconvene as a class, that spokesperson can then share what the group came up with. So I'll go ahead and open up the rooms, and then you can go to your breakout rooms and we will have at it. Okay, we are back now. Hope all the groups had enough time to get the work done. But what we'll do now is again just share out and see what the groups came up with. I'll make sure we're recording again. Okay. See what each of the groups came up with, and I'll just I'll have one group share what you came up with, and then we'll just, if the other groups have different characteristics, then they can always chime in with their different characteristics. So. Anyone want to go first and share what you came up with?
I'll go first.
Okay, go ahead.
Our group came up with funding sources and the inflexible rules and guidelines that we have, the policies that we have to work with within the government sector. The funding sources, we don't have private money where we can do whatever we want. We don't have any discretionary money. All of our money has to be accounted for. And everything we try and do, whether it's to buy a pencil or it's to hire somebody or fire somebody, there are 10,000 rules to have to go by, and 2 inches of paperwork just to do anything. So those are 2 differences that we came up with between the public and the private sector.
Okay, very good, thank you. And yeah, you're right with the funding. We've all experienced that with funding, and just the rules and regulations we need to go through, the audits that we need to do, whether they be performance-based audits or management-based audits. There's a lot to go through. We know that, interim reports and interim budgets and second interim budgets, and and all that good stuff. It does take a long time, and it does makes it different. It does make it difficult because, like you said, we don't have that discretionary fund. We don't have necessarily a slush fund that we can use to fund what we want. We have to go through very regimented procedures in order to spend money, which of course makes sense because we are dealing with public taxpayer money, and so it's understandable. But certainly, from an effectiveness perspective, certainly can be somewhat frustrating. So, good. Any other groups come up with other characteristics you'd like to share?
Professor, I'd like to share.
Okay, go ahead.
We had also the source of funding. That was our commonality with the first group. And then we also had financial rewards based on performance or not. We did have someone that's from the private sector in our group, so that was made it interesting for us. We also had the procurement requirements compared to the private sector. And also, yeah, just the no rewards, kind of the financial staffing side of the employee satisfaction in relation to the rewards of, like, the intrinsic, extrinsic rewards of the positions.
Okay, very well done. Perfect. Yeah, it's difficult when you don't have pay for performance, and it's been difficult to implement pay for performance. I think last week we had discussed at the federal level, even when Congress tried to do bonus pay and merit pay, it was all rhetorical. And so, the rhetoric of it all sounded great, but then when it came time to actually put the money where their mouths were, it didn't work. And they just didn't have the money or didn't have the political willpower to find the money in order to fund that bonus pay and that merit pay. Congress can find money to do a lot of different things, but was unable to find money for bonus and for merit pay. So even when we tried at the federal level, it wasn't terribly successful. Very good. Thank you, Angelica. Anyone else? Any other groups? Anything different?
Yeah, our group came up with the use of labor unions, organized labor, as well as a top-down kind of approach to management that really affects or gives a sense of red tape. But I thought what was really interesting, more than a couple of our group members made a comment of bring your blue pen when meeting with supervisors because they want the signature done in blue ink. So I thought that was very, very interesting, that just something like that could even, really affect, the effectiveness of the organization.
Right. Good. Thank you, Colin. Yeah, and I agree. The labor unions component's been a really important one for the public sector over the past few decades because you already have a lot of regulations from civil service requirements, and then you overlay on top of those collective bargaining requirements and requirements from the collective bargaining agreement from the contract. And what that has done in a lot of organizations is it has caused a centralization of the human resource management function. In that what we've done is because of all these different requirements and to make sure that we're not only compliant with civil service regulations, but also compliant with the CBA, that we've taken a lot of those responsibilities away from managers and centralized those in HR offices with HR professionals to make sure that it's all done appropriately and that there aren't any grievances that can be filed based upon actions taken. So that centralization result has really been an interesting one for a lot of organizations. Great, thank you, Kyle. Our fourth group, anything different or similar?
Yeah, I mean, we had some of the same things. We talked about funding and things like that. So two of the things that I think we haven't discussed was public organizations are run by elected officials. So the person who's running the agency is elected, and that can change over the course of a term, however long that might be, 2 to 4 years. Hiring practices, civil service protections. Once they get past that probationary period, it's harder to fire them in the public field. But at the same time, it's hard to get promotions, and also unions are very common in the public sector.
Yep, well done, exactly. And Yeah, I think it's an important point. You made a couple of important points there. The one, when the agency is headed up by an elected official, yes, there certainly can be a lot of turnover, as you discussed and as we discussed earlier. Also, you sometimes wonder about the direction of the organization then, and why the organization takes the direction it does if it's being led by elected officials, especially within the context of that Mayhew discussion we had earlier with the re-election type of motivation. Hiring is a protracted process in the public sector. So I'm glad that your group talked about that as well, that hiring takes a long time. And as we know, in the private sector for at-will employees, it's a quicker process to hire an at-will employee. It's quicker to sanction, dismiss that at-will employee. It's quicker and easier to pay that that employee based upon performance than it is in the public sector. And I don't know for each of you individually, when you got your positions with your public agency, how long that hiring process took. But it usually takes months, and sometimes up to 4 to 6 months. And we lose a lot of talent that way because they get offers from private sector corporations. They go off to those private sector corporations, and you can't really blame them for not being willing to wait those 4 or 5 or 6 months it takes to get the position with the public agency. Very good.
Yeah,
Well
I have
done.
talked to HR as well, and for like high-end position like city manager or any department head, it costs HR at least $100,000 to go through the whole hiring process, because they had to get an external organization to get it. So it's highly costly to do it too. Like there is a reason for the process, but it's a lot of money.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, I think, and it's a much smaller scale hiring faculty members, but the last faculty member that I hired, I believe we spent as a department about $20,000 to $25,000, I think, overall on that hire. And that's because there's a national hire. We had targeted recruitment, and we engaged with some executive search firms to help with it. It was a long, protracted process that cost us about $20,000 to $25,000, and that was just for one faculty member. So it can be very expensive, in addition to being very time intensive. Yeah, and sometimes it depends on the organization. It depends on where they're at in the hiring process, and sometimes it can be quicker than that. But for a lot of folks, it's several months before they can get hired into those positions.
And also, I wanted to. So it was mentioned that public organizations are managed by elected officials. Something that is a big critique of public organizations, especially the government, is that most of the management is done by non-elected positions, but people that are assigned to those positions. So I don't know how exactly, because yes, the elected officials cannot drive the direction of an organization. Like let's say if we look at the federal government, people in Congress make the laws, but they don't really enforce the law. It's other people that had to do that, and that's why there is a big conflict of everything pretty much on that degree. So I don't know if you can kind of like give a little bit more of opinion or a little bit information on that, or how to deal with that.
Sure. Yeah, and a couple different examples. One example, and we don't see, well, we do see kind of a variation on this in Los Angeles County, but it's the commissioner form of government. And a commissioner form of government, commissioners are elected officials in that they're elected into this commission, but each commissioner is then the head of an executive department. And so, the city I used to live in many years ago, we had a commissioner form of government. And so we had 3 commissioners. Each commissioner was then the head of a different agency within that local government. So one commissioner was in charge of the Department of Parks and Recreation. Another commissioner was in charge of the Department of Public Works. And so that's an example in that commissioner form of government of kind of blending together the elected legislative position with the more administrative position of being the head of a department. So that commissioner form of government is kind of one example. Another example is just, from my experience on the school board, members of the school board are the elected officials, and then you hire a superintendent and assistant superintendents, directors to do the day-to-day functioning of the organization. But all the decisions for the organization are made by, the major decisions are made by the governing board. And so the superintendent works for the governing board. And so the superintendent may bring recommendations to the board, but the board does not necessarily need to accept those recommendations and can make its own decisions in terms of the direction the board thinks that that district should go. And so, you do have some political imperatives, obviously, unfortunately, when you have elected officials who have those final decision-making roles. And so it's kind of that blend of politics and administration that can sometimes be somewhat difficult. So, but yeah, it's said in text chat, going back to the hiring process, you do lose a lot of candidates sometimes just because of that protracted hiring process. There's a reason for it. We all understand why we do it. We understand why it's necessary, but it can be somewhat frustrating.
Another thing that we talked about in ours was that how involved the political world is and the impact that it has on all of the different state agencies, and the fact that they weigh in on our outcomes for one reason or another. They can withhold funds, or they might have the ability to stop us from taking a position on a certain thing or something like that. So they're an active part of our outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And the state government can set goals for organizations. They can set expected outcomes, and then those organizations have to then try and achieve those outcomes with the outputs that they're creating. But those outcomes are established at the state level, or, like in the school district, the county, as well as at the state level, back under No Child Left Behind, established at the federal level even. And these are, goals that are established for you that you then have to meet those goals. There's some flexibility in terms of how you go about meeting those goals at times, but the goals are established external to your organizations. That's very, very true. Shortage in the text chat, shortage in staffing due to COVID. One think they would loosen some of those political hurdles. True. One would hope so, but I just think the nature of employment changed so much during the pandemic that a lot of organizations are still grappling with, do they return to pre-pandemic processes? Do they keep with their current pandemic approaches, or do they come up with a hybrid approach whereby, positions can be both in person as well as virtual? And organizations are still really struggling with that. I know at Long Beach, we're struggling with staff for a year were working completely virtually, and then they are starting to come back onto campus. They've established the fact that they can work effectively and efficiently virtually. So the question then becomes, can they then incorporate some virtual work into their normal duties? And I think a lot of staff unions are pushing very hard for that. I think university administrations are sometimes a little hesitant to allow that to happen. That then becomes a meet and confer issue, and because it's a condition of work, and then that goes through then the collective bargaining process. As Angelica says, politics influence outcomes in both public and private, sadly. Yeah, I mean, certainly political imperatives oftentimes trump economic imperatives, as we had mentioned last week. And so if something can make a great deal of economic sense, can make a great deal of practical sense, if it doesn't make political sense, there's a good chance that it simply will not happen. And that's just the reality in which we work as public administrators. Excellent. Okay, I think we got all four groups. So we had some good commonalities, but we also had some differences as well. Again, just to kind of, this is, like I said, the lecture lab approach. So we covered all these ideas in the first half of class, and then this is you then applying them to your organization. This also obviously will be helpful for your second Canvas essay as you are discussing your organization compared to a private sector organization and some of the differences that really make your organization distinctive from a private sector organization and what those differences really mean for effectiveness in your organization. Again, if you're working in a private organization, you'll just reverse the logic and compare it to a public organization or differences with public organizations. Okay, well done. It's about 8:30, so I think we've covered what we need to cover for tonight. Again, you have your Canvas essay in response to a classmate, initial post due by Friday, response post due by Sunday, and then you have your background paper, which is due on Monday, February 7th. Tanya, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, Professor, question. With my issue, I'm in the middle of a transition. And so right now I am currently being employed as a resource family parent. And I wanted to focus on issues from that. Can I, or should I go from my past employment and work from those issues? I would like to focus on foster and in that sector. Is that possible?
I think that if you can identify some issue or problem that is kind of an impediment to you being successful in your current role, I think that will work fine. And I think my preference would be to see you work with something that involves what you are doing now that
Yeah.
can actually have a difference for what you're doing now as opposed to focusing on the past.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. That's a great question. Any other questions about the background paper that's due on the 7th? Okay. If any questions emerge, as always, feel free to send me an email. Happy to answer any questions. If you have a question as whether or not your problem or your issue will be appropriate, feel free to send me an email. I'll get you feedback on that as well. I look forward to reading your Canvas essays. I also look forward to reading your background papers. So hope everyone has a great week and upcoming weekend, and I will talk to you again then next Monday. Thanks a lot. Take care, everyone.
Bye all.
Professor, can I ask you a question about my topic?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, this is Melissa, sorry. I was gonna do mine based on communication within my unit, not necessarily within the organization itself, because it seems to run pretty well. But we have a really big problem with communication from our manager over big things, little things, everyday things, anything. And it's something that continuously is addressed with her, and it seems like a lot of us can't move forward because of her lack of communication issues. Is that something that could be used?
Absolutely. I mean, that I've seen that topic used. Oh, sorry, I can't remember. I see that topic used frequently in the past, and it's worked well. We are going to talk later in the term about the role that communication plays in terms of organizational effectiveness, and we'll introduce a few different theories about how to improve communication for effectiveness. So it fits really well with what we cover in the class, and I've seen it used effectively in the past. So I think that's perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. Take care.
You too.
I have a question, Professor.
Yeah.
Am I able to use like leadership styles within the organization in terms of like employee retention?
Absolutely. And we'll spend an entire week in the course talking about leadership and the connection between leadership and effectiveness. But yeah, when you have a leader who's not exhibiting an effective leadership style, it's probably going to lead to turnover in the organization. That's one of the major causes of turnover. So it's been done before by students in the past, and it's worked beautifully.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, my pleasure.